Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance and watched the stars through the main screen. His ship was 3 months into a deep space mission when the sensors picked up something that made everyone freeze. Dr. Lisa Carter looked up from her workstation with wide eyes and said the readings were impossible. Lieutenant Ryan Brooks ran his hands over the weapon controls and shook his head because nothing in their database matched what they were seeing. The alien ships appeared, like ghosts in the darkness of space. They were huge and sleek, with surfaces that seemed to bend light around them. The lead vessel was 10 times bigger than any human ship ever built, and it moved with a grace that made Jake feel sick in his stomach. Behind it came dozens more ships, in perfect formation, like a school of metal fish swimming through the void. Jake had been a captain for 15 years and had never seen anything like this. He ordered his crew to yellow alert and tried to keep his voice steady when he spoke to Earth Command. The communication took 8 minutes to reach Admiral Kevin Walsh back on Earth, and 8 more minutes for his reply to come back. Those 16 minutes felt like 16 hours while the alien fleet moved closer to their position. Dr. Carter worked frantically at her science station, trying to understand what their sensors were telling them. The energy readings from the alien ships were off the charts, and their technology seemed to work on principles that human science barely understood. She had studied xenobiology her whole life, but had never expected to actually meet aliens. Now, that the moment was here, she felt both excited and terrified at the same time. The first alien message came through their communication system like a hammer blow. The voice was deep and cold, and spoke perfect English, even though no human had ever made contact with them before. Fleet Commander Vextar introduced himself as the leader of the Zephyrian Empire, and his words made Jake's blood run cold. The aliens had been watching Earth for months, and had decided that humanity was ready for what they called integration into their empire. Lieutenant Brooks watched his weapon readings and knew immediately that they were outgunned by an impossible margin. The smallest alien ship carried more firepower than their entire fleet back home. Their shields were so advanced that human weapons would probably bounce off them like toys. He had trained his whole life to defend humanity, but now faced an enemy that could destroy them without breaking a sweat. Commander Vextar explained that the Zephyrian Empire had conquered 47 worlds using the same simple method. They would arrive with overwhelming force and give the local species one chance to surrender peacefully. Those who accepted would be allowed to live under Zephyrian rule, and those who refused would be eliminated completely. He spoke about genocide like other people talked about the weather. The ultimatum was simple and brutal. Earth had 72 hours to surrender unconditionally or face complete destruction. Vextar said his scanners had analyzed human technology and found it primitive and laughable. He seemed genuinely amused that such a backward species had managed to develop space, travel at all. His confidence was absolute and terrifying. Jake listened to the alien commander's words and felt anger building in his chest. Vextar spoke about humans like they were insects to be stepped on or pets to be trained. He clearly believed that his superior technology made victory inevitable and that resistance would only lead to unnecessary suffering. The alien had probably given this same speech to 47 other species and watched them all kneel in defeat. Dr. Carter managed to establish a basic translation protocol and began analyzing the alien language patterns. What she discovered made her hands shake as she typed her report. The Zephyrian Empire was vast beyond imagination, with technologies that humanity could barely comprehend. They had perfected faster-than-light travel thousands of years ago, and their weapons could crack planets in half. Back on Earth, Admiral Walsh received Jake's report and immediately called an emergency meeting of the Defense Council. Colonel Danny Parker arrived within minutes, along with Dr. Amy Johnson and dozens of other military and scientific leaders. They all knew that conventional warfare against such an advanced enemy would be suicide, but surrender was not an option, either. The alien fleet maintained its position just outside the solar system like a pack of wolves waiting for the right moment to strike. Their ships were beautiful and terrible to behold, with curves and angles that seemed to defy physics. Every few hours, they would broadcast their ultimatum again, as if reminding humanity of how little time remained. Jake ordered his ship to maintain a safe distance, while continuing to observe and record everything about the alien vessels. His crew worked around the clock gathering whatever intelligence they could, but the more they learned, the more hopeless their situation seemed. The Zephyrian Empire had perfected the art of conquest through overwhelming technological superiority. As the hours ticked by toward the deadline, Jake wondered if humanity would go down fighting or simply accept the inevitable. He had always believed that humans were special somehow, but now faced with evidence of their cosmic insignificance, he began to doubt everything he had ever known about his own species and their place in the universe. Commander Vexitar stood in the command center of his flagship and studied the primitive world before him. Earth hung in space like a blue marble covered in swirling white clouds, and he could see the lights of human cities dotting the night side of the planet. His tactical computers had finished their analysis of human civilization, and the results were exactly what he had expected from such a young species. The humans had barely mastered nuclear fusion, and their fastest ships could only reach a fraction of light speed. Their weapons were crude projectile systems and simple energy beams that could not even scratch Zephyrian shields. Most amusing of all was their military organization, which seemed to be split into dozens of competing factions that could barely cooperate with each other. Vexitar had conquered 47 worlds using the same proven strategy, and Earth would be no different. His empire had perfected the art of subjugation through overwhelming technological superiority combined with precise psychological pressure. Give the primitives just enough time to realize how hopeless their situation was, and most would surrender, without firing a shot. On Earth, Colonel Danny Parker stood in the war room at Defense Command and stared at the tactical displays showing the alien fleet. The enemy ships were positioned just outside the solar system in a formation that could strike at any target within hours. Every human military base and major city was already targeted, and there was nothing they could do to stop what was coming. Dr. Amy Johnson worked frantically with teams of scientists around the world trying to find some weakness in the alien technology. The energy readings from their ships suggested power sources beyond human understanding, and their weapons could probably destroy entire cities with single shots. Worse still, their communications showed they were part of a vast empire spanning multiple star systems. The first human response came from President Martinez, who addressed the world in a speech that was broadcast to every nation. She spoke of humanity's refusal to bow to tyranny and called for unity in the face of an existential threat. Her words were brave, but everyone who heard them knew that courage alone would not be enough against such overwhelming odds. Captain Morrison continued to observe the alien fleet from his position aboard the Defiance. Dr. Carter had made contact with several Zephyrian officers and was learning disturbing details about their empire. The aliens seemed genuinely puzzled by human defiance and could not understand why such an inferior species would even consider resistance. Lieutenant Brooks spent hours analyzing the alien ship designs and weapon systems looking for any possible weakness. The Zephyrian vessels were masterpieces of engineering with perfect symmetry and flawless construction. Their hulls were made from materials that did not exist in human science, and their engines created space distortions that allowed faster-than-light travel. What troubled Brooks most was how standardized everything appeared to be. Every Zephyrian ship was built to exact specifications with identical weapon arrays and shield generators. Their formation flying was perfect, and their communication protocols followed rigid patterns that never varied. It was like watching a machine operate rather than observing living beings making tactical decisions. Meanwhile, civilian engineer Carlos Rivera worked in a secret facility deep underground where the military had gathered their best technical minds. Project Wildcard was born from desperation and the knowledge that conventional weapons would be useless against the invaders. If humanity was going to survive, they needed to do something that had never been tried before. Rivera studied the limited data they had on Zephyrian technology and began to see patterns that others had missed. The aliens had indeed perfected their sciences, but perfection came with a price. Their systems were so refined and optimized that they left no room for adaptation or improvisation. Everything worked exactly as designed and nothing more. Programmer. Helen Davis joined Rivera's team and began working on what they called chaos algorithms. If the aliens expected logical, predictable responses, then humanity's best strategy was to be completely illogical and unpredictable. Human technology might be primitive, but it was also flexible in ways that Zephyrian systems could never match. The alien deadline drew closer, and panic began to spread through human populations worldwide. Some governments called for immediate surrender, while others prepared for a fight they knew they could not win. Religious leaders spoke of the end times, and scientists worked around the clock searching for miracle solutions that probably did not exist. Commander Vexitar received reports from his scouts and felt satisfied with what he saw. Human military forces were mobilizing, but their preparations were chaotic and uncoordinated. Some of their ships were moving to defensive positions, while others seemed to be fleeing the solar system entirely. It was exactly the kind of panic response his psychologists had predicted. The Zephyrian commander had seen this pattern many times before. First came defiance, then doubt, then desperation, and finally submission. The humans were already showing signs of internal conflict as different factions argued about how to respond to the ultimatum. By the time his fleet attacked, they would be too divided and demoralized to offer any meaningful resistance. Dr. Carter continued her communications with the aliens and began to understand how their society functioned. The Zephyrian Empire was a perfect hierarchy where every individual knew their exact place and function. They had eliminated chaos and uncertainty from their lives through rigid structure and absolute obedience to authority. It was efficient but also brittle in ways they did not seem to realize. Captain Morrison gathered his senior officers and shared what they had learned about the enemy. The aliens were certainly more advanced, but they were also overconfident to the point of arrogance. Vexitar clearly believed that technological superiority guaranteed victory and had not bothered to study human psychology or tactical thinking beyond the most basic level. As the final hours before the deadline ticked away, humanity prepared for war in the only way they knew how. It would not be a fair fight, and they would probably lose, but they would make the aliens pay a price for their victory. Sometimes, that was all you could do when faced with impossible odds. The 72-hour deadline expired at exactly noon, Greenwich Mean Time, and the Zephyrian fleet moved into attack formation with mechanical precision. Commander Vexitar gave the order to begin the invasion and watched with satisfaction as his ships advanced on their primitive targets. The humans had refused to surrender, which meant they would have to learn their place through superior firepower. The first wave of alien ships swept through the outer solar system and destroyed 3 human outposts before their defenders could even react. The Zephyrian weapons fired beams of pure energy that cut through human shields like paper and vaporized entire sections of hull plating in seconds. It was not a battle, but a demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. Captain Morrison watched the destruction from the bridge of the Defiance and felt his heart sink as ship after ship disappeared from his sensors. The human defense fleet had been scattered across multiple positions, but the aliens were picking them off one by one with ruthless efficiency. Their tactical computers seemed to predict every human move before it happened. Admiral Walsh coordinated the defense from Earth Command, but knew that conventional tactics were useless against such an advanced enemy. The aliens moved their ships in perfect formation, and their weapons never missed their intended targets. Worse still, human weapons seemed to have no effect at all on the Zephyrian shields, which absorbed every attack without showing any sign of damage. Dr. Carter continued monitoring alien communications from her station and discovered something that made her blood run cold. The Zephyrians were not just conquering Earth, but were also planning to use human survivors as slave labor in their mining operations. They spoke about humans like livestock to be sorted and processed according to their usefulness to the Empire. The orbital defense platforms around Earth lasted less than an hour before being reduced to glowing debris. The aliens used focused energy beams that could slice through the strongest human materials, and their shields deflected every missile and projectile weapon in the human arsenal. It seemed that nothing could stop their steady advance toward the planet itself. Lieutenant Brooks watched his weapon systems display and realized that their ship was about to be targeted by the alien fleet. The Defiance was badly outgunned, but Jake had ordered them to maintain position and continue gathering intelligence, even if it meant certain death. Sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was witness the enemy's capabilities for those who came after. The first alien attack on the Defiance came without warning as an energy beam lanced through space and struck their port shield. A ray. The ship shuddered under the impact, and sparks flew from overloaded control panels as systems throughout the vessel began to fail. Brooks returned fire with everything they had, but their weapons simply bounced off the alien ship's shields, without causing any damage. Commander Vextar observed the human response with growing amusement. Their ships were fighting bravely but uselessly against weapons and defenses they could not hope to penetrate. The humans were following exactly the same pattern as every other primitive species his empire had conquered. First came futile resistance, then desperation, then finally submission. Captain Morrison knew his ship was dying but refused to abandon his post or surrender to the aliens. Instead, he ordered his crew to implement a desperate plan that violated every rule of space warfare. If their weapons could not penetrate alien shields, then they would have to find another way to damage the enemy fleet. Engineer Pete Williams worked frantically in the engine room to overload their fusion reactor, while Claire Thompson sent out a final message to any human ships in range. The Defiance was going to ram the nearest alien vessel at maximum speed, and they wanted other captains to know that conventional tactics were worthless against this enemy. The alien commander watched the human ship change course and accelerate, directly toward one of his escorts. His tactical computers calculated the impact trajectory and determined that the primitive vessel posed no threat to their superior shields and armor. The humans were apparently planning some kind of suicide attack, but Zephyrian defensive systems could easily handle such crude tactics. What Vextar did not understand was that human desperation could drive them to attempt things that no logical species would ever consider. The Defiance accelerated to ramming speed and struck the alien escort ship with the force of a nuclear explosion. The impact overwhelmed the Zephyrian shields through sheer kinetic energy and tore a massive hole in their hull. For the first time in the battle, an alien ship had been damaged, and the psychological effect on both sides was immediate. The Zephyrian crew scrambled to understand how their superior defenses had been penetrated, while human forces across the solar system realized that the enemy was not completely invulnerable after all. On Earth, Major Steve Collins received word of the Defiance's sacrifice and began organizing guerrilla cells in preparation for ground invasion. The aliens might control space, but humans had been fighting on planetary surfaces for thousands of years. If the enemy wanted Earth, they would have to take it one city and one building at a time. Dr. Johnson analyzed the wreckage data from the alien ship and made a startling discovery. The Zephyrian shields were designed to deflect energy weapons and absorb radiation, but they were vulnerable to physical impacts at high velocity. Their technology was so advanced that they had forgotten to defend against the most primitive form of attack. Carlos Rivera and Helen Davis worked around the clock to modify human ships based on this new intelligence. If kinetic attacks could penetrate alien defenses, then humanity needed to weaponize every piece of metal they could launch into space. It was crude and desperate, but it was also something the aliens would never expect. The battle continued to rage across the solar system as more human ships adopted ramming tactics against the alien fleet. The Zephyrians began to adapt their formations to avoid close contact, but this defensive posture limited their offensive capabilities and gave human forces time to regroup and plan counterattacks. Commander Vextar found himself facing something he had never encountered before in his long military career. The humans were not following any recognizable tactical doctrine, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves seemed unlimited. His computers could not predict their next move because they were acting on pure emotion rather than logical strategy. The tide of battle was still heavily in favor of the aliens, but cracks were beginning to show in their perfect formation. Human. Ships appeared where they should not be and attacked from angles that made no tactical sense. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered dozens of worlds, but had never faced an enemy that treated warfare as controlled chaos rather than organized conflict. 3 weeks had passed since the invasion began, and Fleet Commander Vextar stared at the tactical displays with growing frustration. What should have been a simple conquest had turned into a prolonged conflict that was draining his resources and testing his patience. The humans continued to fight with tactics that made no logical sense, and their resistance was actually growing stronger instead of weaker. Colonel Danny Parker coordinated the human resistance from a hidden bunker deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. The aliens controlled most of Earth's orbital space, but human forces had adapted to guerrilla warfare with remarkable speed. Small groups of fighters would strike at alien landing sites and supply convoys before disappearing into the wilderness or underground tunnel systems. The Zephyrian ground forces were discovering that conquering a planet was much harder than destroying its space defenses. Human soldiers appeared from nowhere to attack alien patrols and then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Every building could hide snipers, and every street corner might conceal explosives or ambush teams. Dr. Carter had been captured during an alien raid on a research facility, but she was turning her imprisonment into an opportunity for psychological warfare. The Zephyrians kept her aboard their flagship as a specimen to study, and she used every conversation to plant seeds of doubt about their empire's invincibility and the wisdom of their conquest strategy. Major Steve Collins led a resistance cell in the ruins of Chicago where alien forces had established a command post. His team had learned to avoid direct confrontation with enemy patrols and instead focused on disrupting their communication networks and sabotaging their equipment. The aliens relied heavily on technology which made them vulnerable to humans, who knew how to break things. Lieutenant Ryan Brooks had survived the destruction of his ship and now commanded a makeshift fleet of civilian vessels that had been converted into weapons platforms. The aliens expected human ships to follow standard military formations, but Brooks used cargo haulers and passenger liners in ways that no tactical computer could predict. The human strategy was simple chaos, applied to warfare on every possible level. Instead of trying to match alien technology, they embraced their own limitations and turned them into advantages. Human ships were slower than Zephyrian vessels, but they could change direction faster and operate in ways that alien pilots found impossible to anticipate. Carlos Rivera had established hidden factories throughout the solar system where human workers built weapons and equipment using salvaged alien technology. The Zephyrians had superior materials and power sources, but humans were learning to combine them with their own designs in ways that created completely new capabilities. Helen Davis had cracked portions of the alien communication network by recognizing patterns that the Zephyrians themselves had forgotten. Their empire was so vast and old that many of their protocols had become automatic responses rather than conscious decisions. This predictability became a weakness when facing enemies who refused to follow any predictable patterns themselves. Commander Vextar received disturbing reports from other sectors of his empire where human tactics were beginning to spread to conquered species. Worlds that had been pacified for decades were suddenly experiencing rebellions inspired by Earth's example of impossible resistance. The humans were not just fighting for themselves, but were inadvertently teaching the galaxy that the Zephyrian Empire could be challenged. Dr. Johnson had analyzed wreckage from dozens of alien ships and discovered that their technology followed rigid design principles that left no room for improvisation. Every system was perfectly optimized for its intended purpose, but could not adapt when faced with unexpected situations. Human technology was cruder, but also more flexible and capable of being modified on the fly. The psychological impact of prolonged resistance was beginning to affect both sides in unexpected ways. Human morale remained high despite terrible casualties because they were proving that the aliens were not invincible. Meanwhile, Zephyrian forces were experiencing doubt for the first time as their absolute confidence in technological superiority began to crack. Captain Morrison had been presumed dead after the destruction of the Defiance, but he had actually survived in an escape pod that drifted undetected through the battle zone. He was rescued by a human salvage crew and immediately began planning a return to the fight using tactics that would have been considered insane under normal circumstances. Ben Rodriguez worked in an underground factory where civilian volunteers converted everyday objects into weapons that could damage alien equipment. Kitchen knives became armor-piercing projectiles, and household chemicals were mixed into explosives that could penetrate Zephyrian shields through sheer unpredictability rather than superior firepower. Nancy Scott organized networks of children and elderly civilians who gathered intelligence about alien movements and passed information to resistance fighters. The Zephyrians had dismissed human non-combatants as irrelevant, but these overlooked populations became the eyes and ears of the rebellion. The war was entering a new phase where neither side could claim clear victory. The aliens still possessed overwhelming technological advantages, but were discovering that superior weapons meant nothing if they could not predict where and when their enemies would strike. Human forces had accepted that they could not win through conventional means and had embraced chaos as their primary weapon. Fleet Commander Vextar found himself commanding an empire that was beginning to question its own methods for the first time in centuries. The humans had done something that no other species had managed in decades of conquest. They had made the Zephyrian Empire doubt itself, and that doubt was spreading to other worlds, like a virus that threatened the very foundations of their civilization. The battle for Earth continued, but the real war was being fought in the minds of both species. Humans were discovering that they possessed capabilities they had never known they had, while the aliens were learning that technological superiority was not the same thing as invincibility. The outcome would depend not on who had better weapons, but on who could adapt faster to circumstances that neither side had anticipated when the fighting began. 6 months into the war that was supposed to end in days, Captain Morrison returned from the dead, leading a fleet of human ships that looked like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. The vessels had been rebuilt using salvaged Zephyrian technology, combined with human engineering in ways that violated every known principle of spacecraft design. They were ugly and asymmetrical, but they worked in ways that alien computers found impossible to predict. Commander Vextar watched the approaching human fleet with growing alarm as his tactical systems failed to categorize the strange vessels. Some appeared to be cargo ships fitted with alien weapons, while others looked like warships that had been rebuilt from spare parts. None of them followed standard design principles, and his computers could not calculate their capabilities or likely tactics. Carlos Rivera's Project Wildcard had finally reached full implementation, as human ships began to demonstrate abilities that should have been impossible with their primitive technology. Vessels could reconfigure themselves in the middle of battle by extending new weapon arrays or shifting their hull configurations to deflect incoming fire. The aliens watched in horror as human ships literally reinvented themselves during combat. Dr. Amy Johnson had established research teams throughout the solar system that worked around the clock to reverse engineer alien technology and adapt it to human needs. The Zephyrians had superior materials and power sources, but humans were learning to use them in ways their original designers had never intended. Innovation was happening faster than alien tacticians could develop countermeasures. The human fleet struck at the alien formation using tactics that seemed to come from a fever dream rather than any military academy. Ships would split apart in the middle of battle only to reform into new configurations moments later. Weapons would fire in patterns that made no mathematical sense, but somehow proved devastatingly effective against alien defenses. Helen Davis had not only cracked the Zephyrian communication network, but had begun inserting false information that caused alien units to attack each other or move to positions where human forces could ambush them. The aliens relied so heavily on their computer systems that they had forgotten how to verify information through direct observation. Lieutenant Brooks commanded a squadron of modified fighters that could change their weapon loadouts and flight characteristics in real time. The aliens would target what appeared to be a reconnaissance craft, only to discover they were attacking a heavily armed bomber that had disguised itself using adaptive camouflage technology stolen from their own ships. Major Steve Collins had expanded his guerrilla operations to include captured alien technology that his teams had learned to operate through trial and error. Human soldiers were using Zephyrian weapons against their former owners, and the psychological impact was devastating to alien morale. Their own technology was being turned against them by primitives who should not have been able to understand it. The tide of battle was shifting as human adaptability began to overwhelm alien technological superiority. Every engagement taught human forces something new about their enemies, while the Zephyrians found themselves fighting opponents who seemed to evolve between battles. Their perfect formations and standardized tactics were becoming liabilities against enemies who refused to fight fair. Dr. Carter had become an expert on Zephyrian psychology during her months of captivity, and she used this knowledge to broadcast messages throughout the alien fleet. She spoke directly to individual crew members about the futility of their mission and the growing rebellion in their empire. Her words were carefully chosen to exploit weaknesses in their rigid social structure. Commander Vextar received reports from across the galaxy that human resistance tactics were spreading to other conquered worlds. Species that had accepted defeat decades ago were suddenly remembering how to fight, and the Zephyrian Empire was facing rebellions on multiple fronts. The humans had not just resisted conquest, but had inspired a galaxy-wide revolution. Ben Rodriguez had converted his underground factory into a mass production facility that could build weapons and equipment faster than alien forces could destroy them. Human workers had learned to manufacture items using alien materials, but human designs that prioritized function over form. Their products were crude but effective and could be produced in quantities that overwhelmed enemy logistics. Nancy Scott's intelligence network had expanded to include captured alien soldiers who were beginning to question their empire's methods and goals. The Zephyrians had never faced prolonged resistance before, and many were starting to wonder if their cause was just. Human persistence was achieving what their weapons could not by breaking down enemy morale from within. The war had evolved beyond simple conquest into something that threatened the very foundations of Zephyrian civilization. Their empire was built on the assumption that technological superiority guaranteed victory, but humans were proving that determination and adaptability could overcome any advantage. The aliens were discovering that they had become dependent on their technology to the point where they could not function without it. Captain Morrison led the final assault on the alien command ship using a vessel that had been rebuilt so many times it barely resembled its original design. The ship could extend boarding pods that would attach to enemy hulls and cut through their armor using modified mining equipment. It was crude, but effective, and the aliens had no defense against tactics they had never encountered. Fleet Commander Vextar found himself trapped aboard a ship that was being boarded by humans who should have been dead or captured months ago. His perfect defenses were failing against enemies who treated warfare as an engineering problem to be solved rather than a contest between military forces. The humans were not trying to win through superior firepower, but through sheer creative stubbornness. Dr. Johnson's research teams had finally decoded the fundamental principles behind Zephyrian technology and were beginning to improve upon them, using human innovation. The aliens had perfected their sciences thousands of years ago, but perfection meant stagnation. Humans were learning faster than their enemies could adapt, and that learning curve was becoming steeper with every passing day. The final battle was approaching, but the outcome was no longer certain. The Zephyrian Empire still possessed superior technology, but humans had proven that innovation and determination could overcome any advantage. The galaxy was about to learn that there were forces more powerful than advanced weapons, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was one who refused to accept defeat no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The final battle did not take place in space, but in the mind of Fleet Commander Vex Atar as he stood in his command center surrounded by human boarding parties. Captain Morrison had led his crew through the alien ship's corridors using maps provided by Dr. Carter, who had spent months learning every detail of Zephyrian vessel design. The aliens found themselves defending their own ship against enemies who knew it better than they did. Vextar watched his perfect empire crumble as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. 43 of the 47 worlds under Zephyrian control were experiencing major rebellions inspired by human resistance tactics. Species that had been conquered decades ago were suddenly remembering how to fight, and the alien military was spread too thin to contain the uprising. Dr. Carter stood before the alien commander and spoke words that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. She explained that humanity had not defeated the Zephyrian Empire through superior technology or military might, but by reminding the universe of something it had forgotten. The most powerful force in existence was not advanced weapons or perfect tactics, but the simple refusal to accept defeat. Commander Vextar realized with growing horror that his empire had made a fundamental error in their understanding of conquest. They had assumed that technological superiority guaranteed victory, but humans had proven that determination and creativity could overcome any advantage. Worse still, the human example was spreading to other species like a virus that threatened everything the Zephyrians had built. Colonel Danny Parker received the surrender of the alien ground forces on Earth as their commanders finally accepted. That continued resistance was futile. The humans had not destroyed the Zephyrian military, but had instead convinced them that their cause was hopeless. It was a victory achieved through psychology rather than firepower, and it marked the end of an empire that had dominated the galaxy for centuries. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the alien flagship and watched as Zephyrian ships threw out. The solar system powered down their weapons and requested permission to withdraw. The aliens had not been defeated in the traditional sense, but had instead been forced to confront the limitations of their own worldview. They could no longer believe in their own invincibility. Dr. Johnson analyzed the final battle reports and realized that humanity's greatest weapon had not been any particular technology or tactic, but their ability to learn and adapt faster than their enemies. The aliens had perfected their military science thousands of years ago, but perfection meant stagnation. Humans were still evolving, and that evolution had proven unstoppable. Helen Davis broadcast a message throughout the Zephyrian communication network that was heard on every ship and every world under alien control. Her words were simple, but devastating to enemy morale. She told the galaxy that the Zephyrian Empire had been defeated not by a superior force, but by a species that refused to believe in impossible odds. The psychological impact of the human victory rippled across the galaxy as conquered species realized that the aliens who had seemed invincible were actually vulnerable to anyone willing to fight hard enough and think creatively enough. The Zephyrian Empire began to collapse as rebellions erupted on world after world. Fleet Commander Vextar sent a final transmission to his surviving ships as they prepared to withdraw from Earth's solar system. His words would be remembered as the moment when the galaxy's greatest empire admitted defeat to a species they had dismissed as primitive. He acknowledged that the Zephyrians had underestimated humanity in ways that proved fatal to their entire civilization. Carlos Rivera and his engineering teams watched the alien fleet depart and began planning humanity's next steps into the galaxy. The humans had proven themselves capable of defeating the most advanced military force in known space. But now they faced the challenge of helping other species rebuild their worlds and their confidence. Major Steve Collins organized the cleanup, operations on Earth as human forces secured abandoned alien equipment and began the process of reverse engineering technology that would advance human science by centuries. The war had ended, but the real work of building a better future was just beginning. Ben Rodriguez converted his weapons factories back to peaceful production as humanity prepared to take its place among the stars. The industrial capacity that had sustained the resistance would now be used to build ships and habitats for a species that had earned its freedom through courage and determination. Nancy Scott established communication networks that would link Earth with the dozens of worlds that were throwing off Zephyrian rule. The intelligence systems that had coordinated the resistance would now serve to organize a new alliance of free species working together for mutual benefit. Dr. Carter remained aboard the alien flagship as an ambassador to help coordinate the peaceful withdrawal of Zephyrian forces. Her months of captivity had given her unique insights into alien psychology that would prove invaluable in establishing diplomatic relations with other species throughout the galaxy. The war that had begun with humanity facing impossible odds ended with the collapse of the galaxy's greatest empire. The Zephyrians had possessed superior technology and overwhelming military power, but had been defeated by something they could not understand or counter. Human creativity and determination had proven more powerful than any weapon. Admiral Kevin Walsh addressed the people of Earth in a speech that was broadcast to every corner of the planet. He spoke of the courage shown by ordinary citizens who had faced extinction and refused to surrender. The victory belonged not to any single hero, but to an entire species that had discovered what they were truly capable of when their backs were against the wall. The galaxy would never be the same after witnessing humanity's impossible victory over the Zephyrian Empire. Other species had learned that advanced technology was not enough to guarantee success, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was one who treated impossible as just another word for untried. As the alien ships disappeared into hyperspace, Captain Morrison turned to his crew and smiled. They had saved not just Earth, but had reminded the entire galaxy that freedom was worth fighting for, no matter how terrible the odds. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and they had earned their place among the stars through the simple refusal to accept defeat when everyone else would have surrendered.